The modern aristocracy of the mind operates under a highly sophisticated, yet utterly devastating delusion, the worship of the intellect. The contemporary individual is continually conditioned to treat knowledge, education, and analytical depth as the supreme vehicles for human liberation. Society promises that a sharper brain, a massive vocabulary, and the systematic consumption of literature will grant a state of sovereign control, a shield against the vulgar anxieties that plague the uneducated masses. But if one peels back the heavy layers of academic arrogance and observes the mechanism with cold, clinical detachment, the illusion collapses into dust. The intellect was never engineered to make you free. It was designed to make you suffer with absolute surgical precision. Arthur Schopenhauer recognized an immutable biological law that the proud intellectual is entirely too vain to face, that consciousness is the true fountain of pain. In the grand hierarchy of existence, the plant feels no sorrow. The animal experiences immediate physical discomfort, but remains unbothered by the ghost of yesterday or the phantom of tomorrow. It is only the human being, through the hypertrophied development of the intellect, who possesses the terrifying capacity for existential agony. To believe that reading more, knowing more, or analyzing deeper will insulate the spirit from the raw trauma of life is a profound error in calculation. Knowledge does not break the bars of the human cage. It merely cleans the lenses of the telescope so that the individual can watch their own confinement with terrifier, unblinking clarity. The individual who conditions their identity on their analytical capacity is routinely bankrupted by their own thoughts. They view the simple, unreflective masses with a cheap sense of superiority, noting their compliance to the social corral, their shallow amusements, and their mindless adherence to tradition. They assume that because they see the strings of the puppet show, they are somehow outside the theater. They fail to understand that knowing you are a slave does not alter the geometry of the chain. It merely ensures that while the simpleton sleeps peacefully in his ignorance, the intellectual spends his nights pacing the floor of his cell, documenting the exact weight of his shackles. True sovereignty does not worship the mind. It begins when the intellect realizes its own profound impotence to cure the misery of existence. To comprehend the absolute fraud of the intellectual myth, the mind must analyze the raw architecture of organic life. Schopenhauer observed that the intellect is not a divine gift, nor is it a separate spiritual entity. It is a mere biological instrument evolved by the blind will to live to assist the organism in securing its survival. In its natural state, it is meant to scan the environment for danger and utility. But when this instrument becomes overdeveloped, when it escapes its functional boundaries and becomes an autonomous engine of reflection, it transforms into an internal predator. The relationship between intelligence and pain is perfectly linear. High intellect increases the sensitivity of the entire nervous system. transforming the mind into an ultra-high-definition canvas for suffering. The vulgar individual hears a noise. The intellectual analyzes the underlying decay. The simpleton experiences a minor setback and forgets it by dawn. The analytical mind dissects the event, traces its roots to ancient patterns of human malice, and projects its consequences into a bleak, catastrophic future. The intellect acts as a biological amplifier, taking the basic friction of existence and multiplying it into an insupportable weight of psychological rot. The social corral requires this overdevelopment while lying about its price. The economy requires specialized, hyper-focused intellects to power its data systems and corporate metrics. It rewards the analytical mind with titles, status, and high-end consumption tokens, whispering that this is the pinnacle of human achievement. They fail to tell you that the cost of that refined mind is the permanent destruction of peace. A hyperactive brain cannot be turned off at 5 o'clock. It cannot be quieted by a purchase or a vacation. It continues to churn in the dark, turning its surgical edge against the very individual who carries it, dissecting their choices, exposing their hypocrisies, and revealing the bottomless void beneath their curated success. The system buys your genius and leaves you with an uncurable insomnia of the soul. Let us observe the profound vanity inherent in the archive of human knowledge, the library. The intellectuals surround themselves with thousands of pages, leather-bound tomes, and dense philosophical concepts, believing they are erecting a fortress of wisdom. They memorize the thoughts of dead men, master the syntax of complex debates, and acquire an elaborate vocabulary to articulate their discontent. But look closely at the desk under the lamp. The books are being slowly, methodically devoured by moths and dust. The literature is decaying, and the mind that consumes it is decaying just as fast, entirely empty of real answers. Erudition is often nothing more than a strategic distraction from the internal vacuum. The individual reads not to discover truth, since the fundamental truth of life is exceptionally simple and uniformly bleak, but to escape the terrifying task of sitting alone in a quiet room with their own consciousness. They use the thoughts of others to drown out the low, constant hum of their own existential panic. They become collectors of citations, curators of an intellectual museum, hiding their spiritual vacancy behind a wall of text. It is a highly civilized form of cowardice. Schopenhauer made a savage distinction between the man of learning and the man of genius. The man of learning has merely loaded his brain with the property of others. His mind is a heavy, static warehouse that obeys the rules of the herd. The genius, conversely, uses his sight to see reality directly, and what he sees is an arena of pure, unguided will. The intellectual believes that by labeling a tragedy, by categorizing a malice under a specific psychological or philosophical term, they have achieved power over it. But nomenclature is not control. You can name the disease in 5 languages. You can trace its etymology to classical Rome, but the tumor continues to grow exactly the same. Your library is just a well-decorated waiting room for the cemetery. There is a severe, unavoidable penalty of isolation attached to high intellectual clarity. The individual who develops a rigorous, unblinking critical intellect slowly, yet permanently, alienates themselves from the baseline of human society. They lose the capacity to participate in the mutual simulation that keep the herd cohesive. The shallow gossip, the political theater, the corporate rituals, and the manufactured emotional crises of ordinary life begin to look like a tedious, infantile comedy performed by actors who do not know they are on a stage. This lucidity destroys the capacity for casual companionship. The intellectual enters a social gathering and cannot hear the conversation. They can only decode the underlying vanity, the desperate bid for status, and the profound insecurity that drives every sentence. They see through the masks with such clinical precision that the environment becomes an exhausting exercise in tolerance. They cannot join the parade of pretenders, and the herd instinctively recognizes this distance. The masses do not envy the deep thinker, they suspect them. They sense that the silent observer in the corner is a living critique of their entire existence, and they isolate them to protect the validity of their own illusions. The psychological toll of this isolation is immense. The individual spends years searching for an equal, an independent mind capable of sharing the weight of their lucidity. They search through universities, professional circles, and digital networks, only to find the same herd behavior wrapped in more expensive vocabulary. They discover that academic centers are not sanctuaries for truth, but factories for conformity, where the intelligent compete for administrative power and social validation with the same primitive ferocity as street vendors. The search ends in the realization that the higher you climb in intellectual depth, the smaller the room becomes, until you are left entirely alone with a view of a frozen landscape. Let us analyze the profound deception of the rational escape, the belief that the mind can think its way out of suffering. The intellectual assumes that if they can simply understand the mechanics of their pain, if they can map their trauma through psychoanalysis, balance their biochemistry with data, and rationalize their grief through stoic principles, the pain will cease to exist. This is the supreme arrogance of the logic machine, believing that the servant can command the master. But the intellect is merely the servant. The master is the will to live, the primitive, animalistic hunger that drives your heart to beat and your cells to replicate, does not care about your logical deductions. It does not read philosophy. It demands satisfaction, it experiences fear, and it inflicts suffering regardless of how many degrees you hold. When a raw existential crisis strikes, when a betrayal cuts through the architecture of your life, or when the heavy hand of aging arrives, your complex concepts collapse like paper walls. The philosopher screams in the dark with the exact same raw, undignified terror as the illiterate peasant. To spend your life sharpening the mind, hoping to achieve a state of rational invulnerability, is a tragic waste of temporal capital. You are trying to use a sieve to hold water. The intellect can document the storm, it can calculate the velocity of the wind, and it can predict the exact moment the structures will fail, but it cannot stop the rain. The expectation that your knowledge should protect you from feeling the weight of the human condition is the final delusion that must be destroyed. The mind is not an exit from the meat grinder. It is the mechanism that ensures you feel every single turn of the blade. True freedom begins at the exact moment the intellect turns its surgical edge against its own vanity and accepts its ultimate limitations. It is the moment the individual stops reading to accumulate, stops analyzing to control, and looks into the mind as a dark, silent mirror that reflects reality without the demand for an answer. This is the transition from intellectual arrogance to clinical lucidity, the understanding that the ultimate triumph of the mind to know when to fall silent. This is the construction of the sovereign armor against overthinking. The enlightened individual does not use their intellect to build complex systems of thought or to engage in the noisy debates of the day. They use it as a weapon of negation. They use it to systematically dismantle the social slogans, the moral fairy tales, and the digital delusions that the herd attempts to inject into their consciousness. They do not seek to know more. They seek to ensure that what they do know cannot be corrupted by the public market of vanities. Their intelligence is a shield that keeps the world at a distance, not a bridge to join it. Stand firm in the quiet vacancy of your own intellectual isolation. Refuse to let the social corral buy your vital nights with the promise of academic renown or analytical prestige. If the condition for your intellectual success is the participation in their collective theater of validated opinions, the price is an insult to your sovereignty. They have discovered that the ultimate power is not to hold the answers to the universe, but to possess a mind that has refused to be broken by the question. The library is closed. The unwritten contract that promised happiness in exchange for a cultivated intellect was a structural forgery designed by a fearful society. Let the masses continue to chase their certifications, their reading lists, and their digital trivia. There is no salvation in the intellect. There is no comfort in the truth. There is only the raw, unguided will of existence, and the sovereign mind that chooses to look at the dark landscape without blinking and without demanding a lie. The shadow does not require a thesis. It simply abides in its own quiet, glacial strength. Welcome to the final demolition of your intellectual illusions. Welcome back to your own independent kingdom. If you have killed the arrogance of the intellect, leave your mark in the comments. Subscribe to protect your sovereignty in the shadow.